Okay, public judgment versus populism. What's the difference? I mean, public judgment sounds kind of scary. But anyways, it has to do with this book, which I've been talking about for, this is the 16th video now, related to this book and this fellow. If I didn't happen to find this book in a bookstore back in 1995, the likelihood is very good that I never would have bought this. So to get the link between that, you have to look at the old videos and my website and whatnot. But okay, let's look at public judgment first. And in this book, in chapter 4, it talks about public judgment quite a bit. So I will first of all, and I'll switch over to populism now. I'll get to the definition of public judgment in a bit here, but definition of populism, and I just took this off of Wikipedia. It has sometimes been used synonymously with demagogy to describe politicians who present overly simplistic answers to complex questions in a highly emotional manner. Or with political opportunism to characterize politicians who exploit problems and seek to please voters without rational consideration as to the best course of action. So we see this in society, like these cult-like figures who pull their followers around by the nose, or the puppet masters, or whatever you want to call them. And to some extent, they just see which way the wind is blowing. They're fairly cynical themselves, so they're mainly just after power. So this public judgment, how can we get a better idea of what that is? Well, I'll give you a quote out of this book. And remember, on the quote I just gave you, it talked about demagogy or demagogues to describe populists. Page 69 in this book, it talks about the danger of demagogues emerge preaching simplistic solutions. So they know what's going on, and this back in 1995 they knew as well. And in this, they're talking about the scenario. They look at various scenarios for the future, and one of them is this Titanic scenario, and it says government responds to persisting economic distress by reinforcing traditional approaches. The credibility of leaders and institutions is undermined as their responses to the growing crisis are seen to be less and less relevant and effective. Demagogues emerge, preaching simplistic solutions. So you can kind of see that, the 2016 election down in the States. Hillary Clinton, she didn't even visit the Rust Belt states, right? And so Middle America was kind of falling apart, and she was going on whatever. But then, of course, Donald Trump saw this opportunity, and he rushed in, even though he didn't really know what he was doing either. So this kind of tells you that the people that wrote this book, they understand what populism is. And public judgment is something entirely different, and I will get to that later on. So well, one example of public judgment, and I've talked about this in other videos, citizens' assemblies. And so we saw this in BC and Ontario when they chose a random sampling of the entire population and got them together, and it was the people who made the recommendation about how to change the Constitution. It wasn't politicians, right? So that's a good example of public judgment. And I will get more into this whole thing on public judgment because it is in chapter 4 in this book, but for today I'm just going to be going through chapter 1 and 2. Going to go through some of the juiciest quotes and the quotes that really give you a sense of what this book is about. And so citizens' assemblies and is quite a radical solution for doing things, because politicians, of course, they want to keep as much power to themselves as they possibly can. And again, I talked about this in a previous video as well, the part about doing cartwheels on the White House lawn, and in Canada, the amount of power that's concentrated in the Prime Minister's office compared to even the balance of powers that exist in the States there. So if it's such a radical solution, who are the people that have written this book? Well, there's 14 experts that provided the main information in this book, and I'll go through each of these experts, and the first one I'll talk about is Marcel Mauss. And back in the day, in 1995, he was in the Prime Minister's cabinet. He was the Minister for Intergovernmental Relations under John Chrétien, and he was one of those 14 authors of this book. So you would think back then such a radical recommendation coming partly from someone who's in the Prime Minister's office might make a dent in the collective consciousness. You would think that the media and journalists might take an interest in something like that. Well, no, they didn't. I mean, and back then, 1996, I remember calling up a local TV radio station, and they just sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, whatever, and they obviously didn't want to cover it. So I'll go through the other experts right now. What pages are they on? They are on page 15. Sorry, I should have checked it. So one of them is Kees van der Heijden, and I will flash that up on the screen. 26, we've got Christopher Freeman and Richard Lipsey. And so for each of these, just pause the video and have a read through and get some idea of where these people are coming from. Like, these people are obviously elites in society, and they're from business, government, academia. They're right at the top, but they see the problems that the status quo has with running things, right? So that's part of the reason they're recommending this public judgment paradigm. Who else? We have Walter Truett Anderson and Marcel Massé, and I mentioned Massé. He's the cabinet minister back in the 1990s. Be careful you don't mix him up with Marcel Mauss. Their last names are both spelt the same, except Massé, he has that little thing above the E in his name there. I don't know what it's called, and then Marcel Mauss doesn't have it. So one was a conservative cabinet minister, and Massé was a liberal cabinet minister. So just so you don't get confused on that. And then we have Amitai Etzioni and Charles Taylor. That's just the ones in the first two chapters I'll be talking about today. There's the other 14. I will talk about those in a future video. So let's go through these some of these juicy quotes in the first couple of chapters. So this is on page 5. We discussed many examples where the traditional apparatus of government seemed less and less capable of responding to new challenges, so that in the end, the only way to generate any response was to bypass that apparatus. Get that? The traditional apparatus of government seemed less and less capable. Therefore, you have to bypass that apparatus. It's on page 5. That's pretty radical, right? Page 7, this is just kind of cute, but 1995, this was the internet existed, but it wasn't a thing. So some of the verbiage they use in this book is kind of cute. I think the word internet, you come across it only once in this book, and maybe information superhighway they might have used once, but mostly they use the phrase information society. And then on page 9 they also use the term electronic mail. So the term email hadn't even come into existence yet, but they knew, even in the so-called 500 channel universe, which is another term back then, and I'll quote this on page 7, a vast increase in information availability along with greater overload, filtering, and denial. Greater overload, filtering, and denial. So we see a lot of that with social media, the filtering and denial bit. Skip forward quite a few pages, page 35, and they talk about nihilism. And you may not know exactly what nihilism is, but it's just kind of live for the day, forget about the future, and it's just caring about myself and screw society kind of thing. But in here, the nihilists says, like the punk rock subculture. Now that's drawing pretty wide brush, because I still listen to the Clash and the Dead Kennedys, and they're definitely not nihilists. They get engaged with the issues of the day. So I have a bit of a quibble with that term, but they have come to the more or less rational conclusion that if there are a lot of different belief systems out there and they all claim to be true, it's just possible that none of them is true and everybody is lying. Therefore the rationale goes like, fuck it, I'm just, right? And in a world where skepticism about belief systems is widespread, there will be a pell-mell jailbreak into hedonism, violence, and general disaffection from society. and of course we see elements of this in today's world as well. How to counteract that? Page 38, counteracting nihilism. We need to recognize that we live in communities, and that to obtain the benefits of living in that community, there are some norms of behavior that we need to adopt. So, what are those norms? And I talk about this in the previous video, number 15, I believe, talking about Frank Zappa versus Jordan Peterson. I talk about which ideologies does it make sense for us to keep, right? Because Jordan Peterson was cautioning against people just blindly following ideology. So I get into that a bit. So I'll flash that on the screen, where to find that bit too. Page 40, another little snippet about our current system, and this of course is Canada. This book was published in Canada, so most of the a lot of the experts are from the States in here, and there's even probably a few from Europe. But it talks about the parliamentary system. It says the parliamentary system institutionalizes and exaggerates conflict, and that undermines its credibility. Page 41, getting back to media and the internet again. The growth of magazines and newspapers tailored to niche markets and the coming of a 500-channel television world would contribute further to the fragmentation of society, to the proliferation of subcultures with little in common. And of course, we see that with the internet and social media. But the main point is they saw all this coming. Different technologies, but they saw the general trend, and they knew what the best answers were to deal with it. And like I say, public judgment is in there, but it's in a future chapter, so we'll deal with that at a future time. Another quote or two from page 45. In a society, equal participation in government becomes fundamental to our understanding of what legitimacy is. So they're implying that the current state of affairs, because we don't have equal participation in government, they're inferring that the existing government doesn't have a very high level of legitimacy. And then on the same page, same sort of thing, a society in which people actively participate in self-rule is better than one in which people do not take part. Because otherwise, people are just going to get pissed off, and we see the results of that. And it was, January 7th, the insurrection at the Capitol building. Same kind of thing, right? So. Page 50, the importance of material incentives in influencing behavior tends to be overrated, and that we need to recognize that the social fabric and shared values play an even more important role. So they're essentially saying that community is more important for our well-being than just, the next new shiny toy kind of thing. And we all intuitively know that, but we're still bombarded with ads. We still have, there's a sense of, keeping up with the Joneses and whatnot. And then last one, society needs to have most people, most of the time, do what is right without having to be policed or coerced. And again, that ties in with social ties, community spirit, and the whole legal system and law enforcement. Like law enforcement would be a lot easier if our social ties were stronger, right? I guess that's it for this one. Thanks.